partigiano. Oh bella ciao, 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 ciao. Se io muoio da partigiano e tu mi devi seppellire.
Katherine Connolly will be talking about Marx's theory of revolution. Katherine is a member of Counterfire. She's an activist and an author. She's published a book on the sort of radical telling of the life of the suffragette Sylvia Pankhurst, which you can find at our bookstore. Take it away.
Thank you very, very much. I want to start by saying that since the economic crisis, we have seen some attempts to, in some ways, rehabilitate Marx to some extent. Whereas before the crisis, it was very unusual to see any kind of popular books that would mention the thought of Karl Marx at all. Now this is something we're becoming quite familiar with. Even some sort of universities or academic departments are kind of discussing the ideas of Karl Marx in a way that maybe those of us who've been interested in Karl Marx for a long time has been quite sort of surprising. But to the extent that Marx has been sort of rehabilitated, it's been on the question of economics, and it's been, you know, we've seen this on Newsnight, on the television, in the newspapers. There are discussions about what Marx had. Maybe there's a sort of concession. Maybe Marx did have something interesting to say about economics in the light of the crisis, and we see his sort of big beardy head popping up more often than has been before. But the revolution bit, it's argued by these people who want to maybe concede he had something to say about economics. The revolution bit is regarded by these people as utopian, unrealistic, and indeed dangerous. And this really, I think, is based on this idea that we're fed so much of the time that ordinary people don't have the capacity to organise things in a better way, don't have the capacity to organise better society. Indeed, if ordinary people did attempt such a project, they just end up making it worse. You know, we're fed this so often. It's kind of, if you tried to change things, all you'd end up doing would be having a privileged few living at the expense of the vast majority of people, which is interesting that the kind of spectre that we're presented with of an awful society actually looks incredibly like capitalism that we know, the society under which we live at the moment. And, you know, these kind of trite phrases get trotted out in support of this, that, you know, human nature, human beings are just too selfish, human nature is just too selfish to ever be able to accomplish something like that. This sort of attempt to present capitalism as an eternal, natural system that's been around forever, and this is why it's here, because we're all horrible and selfish. Now, these kind of ideas, this sort of promotion of capitalism as this sort of eternal, endless system that just reflects how horrible and sinful we all are, was a myth that was also propounded in Marx's own time, and something which he challenged as well. And there's been a lot of talk today, rightly, about one of the most famous books that Karl Marx ever wrote, the Communist Manifesto in 1848. And in the Communist Manifesto, he in fact addresses this myth. And he says this is Marx writing a kind of angry riposte to this idea. And he's addressing the capitalist class. This is Marx addressing the bourgeoisie. He says, "The selfish misconception that induces you to transform into internal laws of nature and reason the social forms springing from your present mode of production and form of property, historical relations that rise and disappear in the progress of production, this misconception you share with every ruling class that has preceded you." And the sting in that quote for the capitalists, for the bourgeois class in society, the sting in that quote is in the tail, is in the final bit, where Marx says, where he refers to systems of organisation that existed before capitalism, systems that also thought themselves eternal. What Marx was saying is that capitalism is not eternal. Capitalism has a history. Capitalism was born, and what can be born can also die. And he relates this back to the question of revolution, because even capitalism's own dominance was assured by revolution. So revolution is not this historical aberration that some people like to make out that it is. Revolution is in fact capitalism's guilty secret. That this is where it got its very dominance from mass uprisings of human beings. And similarly, revolution wasn't an afterthought for Karl Marx. It wasn't like a glib solution that he came up with after he'd done all this sophisticated thinking about the economic problems of the world. He didn't go, oh yeah, we'll just have a revolution, that'll sort it out. It was not at all an aberration in his thought. In fact, revolution was central to the whole of Karl Marx's life. To go back to the Communist Manifesto, the conclusion, the very climax of that book where he says what communists do, what communists want, the whole point that he defines himself as a communist striving for a better society. He says this about communists. He says, communists openly declare that their ends can only be attained by the forcible overthrow of all existing social conditions. Let the ruling classes tremble at a communistic revolution. So this is Karl Marx, age 30 in 1848. If we go to just after the end of Marx's life in 1883, and we come to, at his funeral at Highgate Cemetery, his long-time friend and collaborator, his greatest friend, gave a funeral oration. As Lindsay German said earlier, there weren't very many people at Marx's funeral, and Engels' oration for his great friend was very, very short. And what he tried to do in that oration was sum up what he thought was important about the life of Karl Marx. And he said this about his friend: Marx was before all else a revolutionist. His real mission in life was to contribute in one way or another to the overthrow of capitalist society and of the state institutions which it had brought into being, to contribute to the liberation of the modern proletariat, which he was the first to make conscious of its own position and needs, conscious of the conditions of its emancipation. Fighting was his element, and he fought with a passion, a tenacity, and a success such as few could rival. Which is a wonderful funeral oration to have, I think. So Karl Marx without revolution is an anathema. Karl Marx without revolution is wishful thinking for today's capitalists who are scrabbling around for some sort of capitalist solution to a capitalist crisis. Revolution was integral to Karl Marx's whole life. It was integral to and inseparable from his understanding of history, his understanding of economics, his understanding of politics. And to start with history, it is for this reason. At the beginning of the Communist Manifesto, Marx talks about history being driven by class struggle. And he refers back to the way this has driven change all the way through history. Sometimes this struggle has been very obvious and apparent, sometimes it's been more subtle, but he says the whole reason for change has been these conflicts between social classes, between the slave and the slave owner, between the serf and the lord, between the bourgeois and the feudal society. And of course these struggles, that, as I said, sometimes were less obvious, sometimes very obvious, obviously found their sharpest expression in revolution. And Marx was very interested in the bourgeois revolutions that happened for this reason. That when we got, and to describe what he meant first of all by the bourgeois revolutions, Marx was really talking about what had happened when the dynamic, innovative system of capitalism, this dynamic system that constantly was changing things, couldn't continue to grow at the pace that it wanted, couldn't continue to develop in the way that it wanted to and the way that it needed to survive under the more kind of rigid structure of society that the old order of feudalism constrained upon society. And therefore there were these uprisings against that feudal order, in which people who wanted to develop themselves as professionals, who wanted to have a political stake in a new kind of society, participated. And this happened obviously in England in the 17th century, this happened in the American Revolution against British rule, and this happened most famously and most completely in the French Revolution in 1789. But what was interesting as well about these revolutions was that in the course of them, it wasn't just a case of a group of capitalists, a group of people that wanted things to change for their own interests, getting together and creating a revolution. In fact, these revolutions depended on other forces, on other people to help them overthrow this old regime, other people who were just as sick of the feudal order. And this is where we start to get tensions arising in the revolutionary process, because there were those that simply wanted to be the new ruling class, who wanted to see capitalism dominate, who wanted to be able to give capitalism its full its full expanse and allow it to grow, without being fettered by anything from the old order. And there were other people who were looking for something more out of these revolutions, who wanted people lower down the social scale, who participated in the fighting in these revolutions, who wanted something different. They wanted these revolutions to translate into more equality, to actually change ordinary people's lives. And we see these tensions emerge. If you think about the English Revolution, we see the emergence of the levellers and the diggers, people with much more radical ideas about how you could organise society. We see this in the French Revolution, for example, with the sans-culottes, the poorest people in society, the people that had stormed the Bastille, who created the revolution, who died for the revolution, who wanted something very much more out of it, and at the end didn't get that. Now, this was important for Marx. And it was particularly important for him in 1848 when he was writing the Communist Manifesto. And that's because in 1848, Marx, like a lot of people, became aware that a new revolutionary mood was sweeping Europe, and that things weren't going to carry on in the old way for much longer. And it was in response to and inspired by this mood that he starts to write the Communist Manifesto. And within weeks of the publication of that book, we see revolutions sweeping across Europe. Country after country, there were revolutions. And Marx predicted that in Germany, there would be one of these sort of so-called bourgeois revolutions, but that in this revolution, the contradiction between those who wanted change and wanted the professional class to sort of rise to the top, and those who wanted to see society completely fundamentally change for the interests of those at the bottom of society, these contradictions would become unbearable, and therefore the German Revolution would result in the first working class, or what he described as a proletarian revolution. Now, to some extent, Marx was right. The contradictions in the 1848 revolution were unbearable. But in fact, this breaks out, this process that he thought was going to happen, broke out in France, where in February 1848 there was a revolution, and a republic was set up, and there were demands from the people at the bottom of society for the state to actually do and give something to them. They wanted the state to ensure that people weren't going to be living in the same kind of abject poverty and just left to die because the social conditions had changed, or because their firm that they were working for went bust. And the poorest people in Paris demanded of the government that the government create what they called national workshops, and that these be places that the government ran that would give work to people who were unemployed, who could find nothing else to do. And this is the way they wanted to see things organised in future. When the government abolished the national workshops, what happened is we see an insurrection in working class Paris, in the east of Paris. And this was incredibly inspiring for Karl Marx. He was actually in Germany at the time, and he was writing about it in his newspaper, and he really believed this was going to be the first working class revolution. But what Marx sees in 1848 is the bourgeoisie, the people that had come to power, who were at the top of the republic, were actually prepared to turn to counter-revolution. They were more afraid of this working class revolution than they were of the old order. And that in order to stop this working class revolution, they would actually destroy even the revolutionary gains that they made themselves. First of all, the Republican politicians sent in the troops and crushed the June insurrection, this working class insurrection in Paris, militarily. And then they turned to somebody who promised them stability. They turned to Louis Napoleon Bonaparte, who was the nephew of the more famous Napoleon, who came after the French Revolution, they turned to this man to restore order, so-called, and stability, so-called, in France. This was the man who, and he was backed by very powerful sections of the French bourgeoisie at the time. This was the man who destroyed the Republic, set up a dictatorship, and set in motion, really presided over a period of rampant capitalist developments in France. Really, a lot of the things that we associate with France now are features of this period. The massive expansion of the railways, the building of those huge stations, Paris as the centre, the capital of fashion, the massive department stores. This is why it's in this period that Walter Benjamin is thinking about Paris and describes it as the capital of the 19th century. Really became the kind of epitome of capitalist development in very many ways. And so in 1848, Marx sees really that the bourgeoisie are more interested in saving capitalism rather than democracy, that's their main priority. And therefore, for Marx, the bourgeoisie is no longer playing that revolutionary role in history that it had played in the past, that it had played in the Great French Revolution. And it's when he's thinking back about these events, when he's thinking back about the fate of the French Revolution and all the other in 1848, and all the other revolutions in 1848 followed suit, followed by a period of reaction that overthrew those revolutionary gains. It's thinking about that in his book, The 18th Brumaire of Louis Bonaparte, that Marx makes his very famous statement of history repeating itself, history happening first as tragedy and then as farce. And what he meant by that, he didn't mean that something very sad happened and then something like hilarious happened. That wasn't what he meant at all. What he meant was he imagined history progressing like a big classical tragedy, and you would have the bourgeois revolution, then you would have the proletarian revolution, and this would be how change would happen. And really what he said was by 1848, the bourgeoisie was not even capable of playing a heroic revolutionary role anymore. All they were forced to do was kind of caricature, was to parody the past and to give nothing, nothing progressive, nothing to the future, nothing that was going to move history on for anybody. They'd ended up with this non-entity, Louis Napoleon Bonaparte, at the head of the state, who was nothing when you compared him to Napoleon the First, the former emperor of France. He said this is really a very kind of embarrassing sort of caricature of that, and not progressive at all. But it wasn't, for Marx, just bourgeois action that inspired working class hostility and resistance to capitalism. That, Marx thought, was produced by the very structure of capitalism itself. And he looks at this, again, in the Communist Manifesto, and he comments on the tendency of capitalism as it develops to divide society really into two camps. He looked at one section of society that seemed to own all of the property, that owned the means of production, and he described them as the bourgeoisie. And he looked at the other section of society, the section of society that didn't have any property, the people that produced absolutely everything in society, and he described them as the proletariat. And he saw, really, that the people that were doing all the producing, the people that were producing this unprecedented wealth that capitalism saw, were being organised in larger and larger numbers, in bigger and bigger factories, were being collected in bigger and larger groups, working collectively. And he saw that collective work, as well as exploiting groups of workers in large numbers, was actually also translating into the forms in which workers chose to resist that kind of a system. And it's in this period that we see the beginning of unions. We see working people joining together, deciding that if they're going to fight for things to change, for better wages, for better conditions, that they've got to do this together. They've got to do it collectively, just in the way that they work. And these really gave birth to sort of very new ideas of resistance and some sort of hope. I think it's very interesting when we look at the movements in which Karl Marx got involved. He got very involved in the Chartist movement, which at times was a very revolutionary movement. It was a movement of working people that demanded fundamental political change, that the system would be fundamentally changed, hoping that would translate into changes for people socially in their everyday lives. Karl Marx got very involved in this movement, and I think it's very striking when we think about the kind of older generation of Chartists, just how many, as a large majority of them, were involved in those very kind of early efforts as well to form unions. They were involved in the 1820s and the 1830s in those efforts, you know, suffering very much persecution. That's where they kind of learnt these ideas about collective action from. And Marx saw that he focused on this class of people as being the agent of change for a few reasons. That it was precisely the fact that working people didn't have a stake in the system. You know, working people don't have property portfolios that are going to be lost if there's some sort of revolutionary uprising. Working people aren't dependent on their existence for the exploitation of another group of people. They don't have, you know, it's not like the bourgeoisie when they were revolting against feudalism, but at the same time were exploiting people in their factories or in their workshops. This is not the case for the working class. And this, for Marx, meant that working class revolution would be fundamentally different to any revolution that had come before in human history. And this is why, this is what he says about it. So to quote from Marx, all previous historical movements were movements of minorities, or in the interests of minorities. The proletarian movement is the self-conscious, independent movement of the immense majority in the interest of the immense majority. The proletariat, the lowest stratum of our present society, cannot stir, cannot raise itself up with the whole superincumbent strata of official society being sprung into the air. And this is really Marx saying that the emancipation of the working class really will translate into the emancipation of the whole of society. And this is why he describes it as the class with radical chains, or the class that holds the future in its hands. He sees that working people, if they're going to have a revolution, the option just to tweak little bits of the system to make it a bit nicer really isn't going to do it, isn't going to translate into that liberation or into any kind of a different system, because the system under which we live is based on the exploitation of the working class. And so working class revolution will, for Marx, meant that this was going to have to be a fundamental break with everything that had come before, organising society for human need instead of always, you know, abolishing the fact that society was fixated on and organised around a small minority of people making massive profits. And this for Marx was the very important precedent that was set by the Paris Commune. So similarly to 1848, in 1870 there was a revolution in France, a republic was set up, and then on its heels another revolution happens, a working people's revolution in Paris, and set up a new form of government called the Paris Commune, and chased out the rich Republican politicians, set up their own working class government. And Marx was tremendously inspired by this development. It was following the events on a day-to-day basis, and really saw this as a very kind of exciting potential future kind of society. He said the working class cannot simply lay hold of ready-made state machinery and wield it for its own purposes. That working people would have to create a totally different kind of society. And this was reflected in the way that the Paris Commune organised itself. From the start they had elections, and these elections were very different from the ones that we know. They elected their representatives, and then if their representatives abandoned the mandate on which they'd been elected, you could recall them. So it's not a situation like today where there's elections once every 5 years and then we never see those MPs ever again. They just disappear off to Westminster, or to, you know, make loads of money with their own property portfolios or whatever, vote for wars that we didn't want, vote for cuts that nobody wanted, all of these kind of things. In the Paris Commune, you could recall the people that you elected. The kinds of people that they were elected were totally different. They weren't, you know, we could look at the parliament and the class of people that still were electing. In fact, in the Paris Commune, a vast majority of people were working people that were elected, and a very large number of them were very young people, people that wouldn't have been listened to under the old society, people that did the menial jobs in society, that would have been regarded as capable of taking political decisions or of running a state. These were the kinds of people that set up the Commune. And it's important to say that the Commune only lasted for a few months before it was ruthlessly crushed. Now that in itself makes it remarkable for the kinds of things they changed in that very short period of time. These were incredibly dramatic changes that we're talking about, and we don't know what they would have gone on to do. But just in these few months they established that as a principle. They were electing different kinds of people. The police were directly accountable to the democratically elected Commune. They elected magistrates, they elected judges. Everything was suddenly up for democratic control, not just a few representatives, but the whole way that society was organised. And they also initiated great social changes in this very short period of time. They got the church out of education, they opened up education for all boys and girls, and there were huge social legislations passed really to change working people's lives. That, I think, is a very important thing for Marx, because he wasn't just about analysing the world, and he didn't see analysing the world as separate from being a revolutionary. Very famously he wrote, "Philosophers have hitherto only interpreted the world. The point, however, is to change it." And that's what Marx was doing as a revolutionary, and I want to sum up by talking about Marx as an active revolutionary. And I suppose that brings me back to kind of what I was saying at the beginning about the way capitalism is organised and the way that capitalism makes us feel, because although capitalism does, Marx was right, capitalism does group us together in these large numbers, and this can lead to us organising together in trade unions to fight for better wages, for better conditions, all of these things. It's true that comes from the logic of working together side by side. There is a contradiction in capitalism. That's not the only thing that gives us other things, completely negative things, which is that capitalism also encourages division between us, encourages us to see other workers as competitors for our jobs, encourages us to look at national boundaries, comes out with this racist rhetoric that encourages us to blame our own people instead of blaming the people at the very top of society, encourages us to feel alienated and passive and like we couldn't change things, like we'd be too incapable of doing it. As I was saying at the beginning, encourages these very feelings. And for Marx, the point of a revolutionary was to oppose that divisive rhetoric, was to point out the interests of the class as a whole and to fight for those interests. That was an extremely important part for Marx of being a revolutionary. He says this in the Communist Manifesto, that, you know, revolutionaries have to point out that the working class's interests are international, that we're not going to be divided up in these ways. But there was also the fact that throughout all of his life, Marx was working with other people. He didn't see a contradiction between what he was writing about capitalism and changing the world and actually going out there and doing it. He didn't see a distinction between the theory and the practice. The one had to help the other. This for him was very, very important. And why he worked with other people, why he joined all these organisations, you know, that you will have heard about today, the Communist League, for example, that he joined, the International Working Men's Association that he helped to found, all of these things. And that's because when we think about changing the world, when we talk about that, we all have different ideas about how we want to do it. There are debates in movements. There were debates in Marx's own time. When we think about the Chartist movement, there were those who wanted it to be a revolutionary movement, who wanted to have a big general strike and then extend this and not go back to work, force the government to its knees. There were those that argued when there was a big demonstration in London, no, let's not march on Parliament, let's just have a demonstration and then go home after that. There were those that you've heard about, you know, from Lindsay German, you've heard about the utopian socialists. And there were those in the Chartist movement who were thinking the same sort of things. Maybe if we just found like our own little society away from everybody else, and we'll all just live there and we'll make things fair and we'll live under fair laws, and maybe everybody will just leave us alone and we can set up the kind of society that we want to live in without having to challenge the horrible politicians and the police and the army. These were the debates that were going on in the Chartist movement, and Marx allied himself with the most radical section, people like Harney until he fell out with him, and people like Ernest Jones, people that were trenchant critics not just of the government and what they were doing in Britain, but also anti-imperialists who were linking up the struggle, people that did want to see a revolution. The revolutionary Chartists were the people that he worked with. It happened as well in the 1848 revolution that I talked about in France. Marx went back to France straight after the revolution broke out. He was invited back by a more radical member of the Republican government. He came back there. There were lots of German exiles living in, sort of revolutionary exiles living in France at that time. And there was a group organised by somebody that Marx knew, a man called Georg Herwegh, who was a poet. And Georg Herwegh said, well, what all the Germans in France should do is they should all get together in one big group, secretly sneak over the border from France into Germany, start the German Revolution, take power, and everybody, this would be the way of doing it. Marx completely opposed this and was organising with those people that said this would be a very flawed strategy that would end badly, which indeed it did. Poor old Herwegh and his gang did get over to Germany but got lost. Then they got found by the troops, so they didn't find the other revolutionaries, and Herwegh ended up in a ditch. People got killed and it was a disaster, and he had to go back to Paris. So strategy is important, I suppose, is the lesson from that. And to intervene in those debates, to sort out what are going to be the best strategies, we have to be organised, we have to debate those things, and we have to argue those things, because although I've talked, a lot about Karl Marx and revolution, the thing that Marx wanted above all was a successful revolution. He did want to see society transform for the better. He'd seen too many revolutions in his own lifetime. He'd seen the June insurrection in 1848, where thousands of working class people were slaughtered in cold blood. He'd seen the Paris Commune, where exactly the same thing happened, but on a much bigger scale. He'd seen all of these things. What Marx wanted to do was engage in a revolution, was to bring about a revolution that would get rid of capitalism, to fight and to win.
Thank you very much, Kate, for that really insightful talk. Kate, after a quick announcement.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's very important that we don't see things in a static way, because capitalism is a very, very dynamic system. It's a very fast-changing system, and not in a good way, certainly at the moment, and much of the time. I mean, who would have imagined 5 or 6 years ago, if we'd been having a similar event as this, who would have believed us if we'd said that in European countries, in Greece and possibly in Spain, we will have left-wing governments that will be confronting the EU, confronting the European Central Bank, confronting the IMF in a way that is actually shaking whatever we think is the likely outcome. It's actually shaking the very core of those key institutions to the system. This is a big change. These are big events that have happened very, very quickly. And so, you have to understand that because the system is so oppressive and so volatile, the resistance can flare up and can develop very, very quickly as well. And also, this means that consciousness and the ideas in people's heads can also change very, very quickly. And I think that people talk about what people's attitude to the system, and it's very, very complicated. I don't really think it's true that people have bought into the system in a big way. I don't think that really describes. There's sections of society that have, but in general, I think if you said to people, would you prefer an egalitarian society where things are shared, where the hospitals are massively refunded, where the railways are renationalised, where the working week is reduced to 35 hours or 30 hours a week, whatever, and so on and so on, I think you'd find the majority would say, I'll have some of that. So it's not that there's a real loyalty to the system. I think the big problem is that people don't believe the change can happen. The sense of powerlessness that we've talked about, atomisation, the sense of alienation, that's the big problem we have to overcome. The lack of hope, the lack of any kind of sense of an alternative. And, in the end of the day, once we've established that idea, that actually there are lots of people who, if given the chance and the opportunity to get involved in a movement that they thought would actually have a chance of success, would get involved, if we think like that, it then comes down to what difference we can make. And it seems to me the difference we can make is essentially about organisation. Just to end on, the situation in Greece now, it seems to me, I mean, who knows, it's another very volatile period and we don't know how it's going to pan out, but for me, the crucial question is, in Greece and in other European countries, are there enough people who are organised, who are prepared to get out on the streets to defend their government under attack by the institutions or even by their own state, get out on the street, defend their government and put pressure on their government to give them the backbone to push the thing through? That's a question of organisation, so we shouldn't take a kind of observer role here. We shouldn't feel ourselves as being neutral observing events. What we do now can make a difference to a crisis if it comes in the next 6 months or the next year or the next 2 years in Britain. Thank you.
What if a revolution happens that there is no violence, or that how can you base your revolution on principles of non-violence and
on this question of agency and identifying the revolutionary section of the working class, I mean, I think the thing is that most people, most of the time, aren't revolutionary. The other important thing to remember, I think, is that revolutionaries don't make revolutions. And there is a battle of ideas to be had, of course, as you say. That is a very, very important thing. But I think what Marx is saying is that actually our daily experience of capitalism actually leads to those fractures with the systems, but there are very few people who kind of accept the system as a whole, who wake up and think like, this is brilliant, I love this system, and like I'm really prejudiced against like absolutely everybody, there is not a cloud in my sky. Most people, while they accept some backward ideas, actually their experience of capitalism is that they go to work and they probably have a horrible time and they probably don't like their boss, or they're opposed to some oppressions but not to others, partly because of their own individual experience. And it's our job, you know, that's where we've got to win the battle of ideas. That is the role of revolutionaries, you know, in many ways, to say that this is part of a bigger system, this is part of a bigger problem. It's not immigrants that are causing the problem for you, it's people at the top of society. And that's, I suppose, the point about, through trying to change the world, or even through trying to change some things about it, we start to change ourselves. I think maybe a good example of this is, we can't predict who is going to be revolutionary, who's not going to be revolutionary, but if you think about this country and the kind of, there's obviously been a huge rise in Islamophobia as a consequence of the war on terror. But if you compare the legislation that the French government has got away with in France, these really, really repressive laws that attack Muslims all the time, why have we not got the same in Britain? I mean, it wasn't because the politicians didn't want to do it. You know, we had, you know, Labour politicians, we had Jack Straw, like, frothing at the mouth, baying to do this, paying to kind of pass the same kind of legislation. I think that is the legacy of a huge mass movement that got loads of people involved, that changed people's ideas. I don't think that British people necessarily, because they're born a little bit north of France, have better ideas about immigration or about multiculturalism or against Islamophobia. It came from practical experience, and it came from a movement that was resolute and blamed the rulers at the top of society. And that legacy is something that wasn't a revolution but was a mass movement that involved people, changed people's ideas. And I think that's very important. This sort of relates in many ways to your question about, like, how many people is it that we need? How do we know when we're strong enough? And I think the thing is, it's about two things, and partly it is that, you know, we never get to pick, really. You know, when the revolution happens is when people can't take living in the old way anymore, but have enough confidence to think that something else, things have got to change. And I think it's sort of based on this, and it's part of the reason why Marx focuses on the working class so much in his writings. If you look at what our ruling class is so terrified about, even one day's strike action, the potential power of working people is enormous. Because we produce everything, it is enormous. It's no coincidence that Boris Johnson wants to stop the strikes on the tube, the strikes of the firefighters, that this is something that he can't bear, because we have the capacity to make this country ungovernable. We have the capacity to stop all of these awful things from happening. Now, it is at that stage when we can make society ungovernable, when we can say, no, it's our turn, it's our priorities now. And it relates to your question as well, I think, about violence, because I think most revolutions aren't very violent. Actually, because we actually do and produce everything, because armies are actually stuffed with people who are working class people. If only it was the case that people who really wanted the wars went off and fought them themselves, we wouldn't have any more problems. But this is not the case. Armies in today's world are recruited from working people, and when you see revolutions happen, when you see people saying enough is enough, we're not going to live in this way anymore, in fact, what you see is that the armies change side. This is usually something that happens in very many revolutions. What tends to happen, the violence tends to happen when you've got, you know, reaction. I've talked about what happened in 1848, talked about what happened in the Paris Commune, or when revolutions become destroyed. You know, we look at what happened in the Russian Revolution, and the fact that revolution depended so much on that revolution becoming international. There being revolutions in countries that were much more economically developed that could support what was going on in Russia. That didn't happen, and it meant that the revolution was fatally undermined. That's where the violence came from. It came from a counter-revolution. It is this question about how many people do you have. The more people you have, the less violent it is, it seems to me. The more people want things to change, the less resistance you're going to get from the people at the top of society. We don't have enough struggle yet, but I think that's why we've got to be on every protest. That's why we've got to see these things as important, why the housing demonstration, occupations are so important, why the demonstration for the NHS was so important, why the anti-austerity ones are so important, why we've got to support all of these, because the bigger that we can make this, the more confidence that we get, I think, in our ability to fight back. As well, on the point about how to persuade people that standing up can be beneficial to themselves and to everybody else, when of course we know that the stakes are often very high. I think when we look back at history, I find history very inspiring. You know, a lot of history is written to kind of make us feel even more miserable. But I think, you know, there are histories of struggles that ordinary people have engaged in incredibly difficult circumstances, who've achieved amazing things. You know, when you find out about the match women's strike in East London in 1888, girls who were like 13 years old, working horrendous hours in the most disgusting conditions you can imagine, and they organised together and they created their own trade union, and they won concessions from bosses who said they would never give in, who absolutely despised these kind of people. When you realise that they can achieve those sorts of things, it's inspiring. It's about achieving our own victories as well. You know, it is the thing that John said, you're more likely to fight tomorrow if you've won something today. And I think that's about doing things collectively. I think that is important, and it's much easier to stand up when you know that you're standing up with other people, that you're going to do it together, rather than just standing up on your own. And there are so many more of us than there are of them. This is something that we can do, that's on our side. The numbers are on our side, and that's what we should use. We should use that collective power, and that does strengthen each other. It is about solidarity and making those things easier. Which relates to this question about if they're so small, the 1%, if it's 1%, how come they're so strong? How come we haven't achieved this sort of victory yet? They are fabulously rich. I mean, they own so much. This is part of the problem. They do own all the places that we work in. They don't just own those, but they also own the vast majority of all the media outlets, which relates to this question about media, which I'll come on to in a minute. Marx said this is one of the kind of classic problems that he confronted, that the ruling ideas of any age are ever the ideas of its ruling class. And what he meant was really, you know, they own the newspapers, they get to print this stuff that says how amazing, coincidentally, they are, and how rubbish we are and incapable we are. Nation states back up these people, are in hock to them, are bribed by them. They are incredibly powerful, but they're only powerful because they're managing to keep us divided, I think. And, you know, so much of the stuff that gets pumped out of the media is an attempt to divide us, to make us feel that we're powerless, to convince us that there's not many more of us, that we're not the 99%. We're English and French and German or from Bangladesh, and this makes a difference, that there are so many more things that divide us that are so much more important. All this stuff is pumped out at us, and it obviously, you know, it very much does have an effect. Social movements and organisation, which is a really brilliant question. You know, over a decade now of social movements achieving incredible and remarkable things, but I don't think it's achieved enough, and for that I do think we need organisation. And I think you have to fit your organisation to what you're up against. You have to fit your organisation to the time. There's no point saying that this from time immemorial is always going to work. You have to organise in different conditions if you're working under a dictatorship to how you would organise in Britain, and we have to be constantly thinking and adapting our organisation to fit our enemy, to fit what they're doing to us, and be able to effectively challenge that. But I do think that, you know, with the social movements, if we look at inspiring examples, the Arab Spring, if we looked at what happened in Egypt, that was an incredible, remarkable achievement that was so inspiring to people across the globe. But that revolution, much like many of the revolutions I've spoken about today, that revolution that people fought and died for, those people who did the fighting and the dying are not the people that run Egypt today. Now, why is that? I think that's because there weren't those alternative centres of power that could really challenge the old Egyptian state, that could really challenge the army when push came to shove. It was created a moment, more than a moment, of hope. It did get rid of the old order, but was it enough? No, I don't think it was, and therefore I think we do need revolutionary organisation. We do need organisations that popularise democracy, that hold on to that make sure that our side is stronger, and we have to be organised. How to win the war of information? Finally, this is a very good place to ask this question. I think there's several things that we need to do. One, I think, is that we subvert the media that we're given. I think one of the most powerful things that happen, we know, but a lot of people haven't had this experience, know that the media constantly lies about things, is completely biased when it pretends to be neutral and discussing these issues. One of the most inspiring things, I think, when we think back to examples of subverting the media, was over the Gaza crisis appeal, when the BBC refused to broadcast that, and Tony Benn went on the news and refused to play by their rules and just read out the Gaza appeal again and again and again with the phone number. And that was a wonderful thing. That was a wonderful thing to subvert it. But why was Tony Benn there? I think Tony Benn was on the news because we'd managed to create a movement that couldn't be ignored. And that's part of it as well. We have to, the reason that we know the media's biased, a lot of us, like my first demonstration, for example, I went on, and then, like a lot of people, I rushed home and switched on the news, expecting that because I've been on this massive demonstration that I would definitely be on the television, and so would everybody else. And no, not a peep, not a mention, anything but. And I think that's something else as well. It is to do with you can tell people the media's so biased, it's so biased, but sometimes people have to actually experience it. They have to experience that kick in the teeth. The fact, you know, the BBC, last year ignored the 50,000 strong anti-austerity march. I mean, it was, you know, completely scandalous. But so many people were on that demonstration. They wrote into newspapers. They complained about it so much that the complaining about the coverage actually got into the news. So obviously, we've got to create our own movements, but we also, I think, have to kind of engage and challenge that media as well. That's what this beautiful website is about. That is the website of our organisation, Counterfire. It is to carry different kinds of news. It is to report on demonstrations, the things that matter to people. So I think that's a part of it as well. It's not the solution in its entirety, but it's something that we can do. And, you know, we carry articles on the site from activists and people that are involved. So if that's the kind of thing that you're into, if you're into subverting that, if you want to get organised, if you want to see this society fundamentally change, this is an organisation that also wants to see that as well. It's doing that in very many ways on the website, but also crucially in movements in every single campaign. So please join us.
E se io muoio da partigiano, oh bella ciao, 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 ciao. Se io muoio